Good evening and welcome to Thursdays with Nami. My name is Peg Morrison. I'll be your host tonight. I am the Assistant Executive Director of Nami, North Carolina. That's the National Alliance on Mental Illness, North Carolina. I'm so glad y'all are here. Thursdays with Nami is our way of building hope and building community around the topic of mental health. Our guest tonight is Dana Sia. Really cool person. We met at a NAMI event in June, and Dana stood out because of her clarity and her wisdom. She's a clinician, a peer, and a suicide loss survivor. She identifies as queer, and in her practice as a clinical person, she focuses on LGBTQ plus individuals. Tonight, she'll be sharing her insights as someone who has lived experience. It puts her right there at the intersection of mental health, suicide loss, and the LGBTQ community. More on that in just a few minutes. As usual, the first part of our show will be an interview with our guest. Partway through, we'll show a video of the week, and then we will spend time taking questions from you, members of our virtual studio audience. Now we're going to pause for the cause and thank our funders. Thursdays with NAMI is funded in part by the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services through the Federal Community Mental Health Block Grant Fund. We're grateful for their guidance and their supports. Moving right along, Dana Sia has a master's degree in clinical rehabilitation and mental health counseling from the University of North Carolina, UNC at Chapel Hill. She has a PhD in rehabilitation counseling and administration from Eastern Carolina University. I love this line from her bio. She lives with mental health disorders, her spouse, and their 3 dogs. Welcome, Dana.
Yeah, thanks, Peg.
Yeah. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. We always like to know the background of our guests, what brought you here tonight. So tell us your story in a nutshell.
Yeah, a brief story, right? Well, I guess it mainly started with my own experiences of mental health as I was growing up, and just kind of over the years experiencing as a mental health consumer. So going and finding a mental health therapist in college is kind of really where my journey with that started, and recognizing the importance of it. And at the same time, as I got to know other consumers of mental health, and kind of recognizing that, especially for those of us in the LGBTQ community, providers weren't always competent or affirming. And so I felt like there was a major gap, and I decided to help address that. I went on to get my peer support specialist certification. You noted my master's and my PhD, so I'll throw out my bachelor's was actually in business administration. So I started my career as an insurance agent and got my certification as a peer support specialist, realized this is what I wanted to do, like full time, wanted to put my life into mental health. And that's when I decided to jump from a 5-year career, into getting my master's and eventually my PhD. And I would really credit my own personal experience with mental health, as well as the loss of my dad to suicide in 2011, to really push me to continue in this direction. And I'm sure this will come up more. This is where all of my passions kind of collide, is in this space.
Well, that's wonderful. And I'm sure it benefits the people in your office and the people in your world to have those experiences and that wisdom. So I really I've mentioned a few times, I like your bio, especially the line about LGBTQ plus misfits. How did you come up with that particular phrase?
Yeah, and I think, it can be seen in a lot of different ways. And for me, it just felt like the folks that I connected with the best, we kind of found ourselves as misfits. So maybe there were times when we felt weird, or we didn't feel like we necessarily fit in with the larger LGBTQ community, even though we still identified within the community. And so for me, a lot of that falls within the overlap of like neurodivergence, disability, and LGBTQ community. And that's where I feel like sometimes those of us who fall in those 3 intersections find ourselves as misfits within the LGBTQ community.
I got familiar with the LGBTQ community in the 80s and 90s. And it seemed at that time there was more of a trend. I felt like there was an expectation that you would be a certain way. You know, if you dated women, you did not wear makeup, you did not shave, you did not do certain things. But it seems better now. It seems like there's a little more space in the community to just be whoever the heck you are and not have to conform to a new version of the gender roles.
Mhm.
Did
Yeah.
you feel that?
Yeah, I do. And I think that we are starting to kind of blur the lines between what it means to be a stereotypical insert identity here. And I would accredit a lot of the advances, if not all of the advances, the LGBTQ community has made on the transgender, gender non-binary, gender queer folks who have been the ones at the front lines of this and really pushing for all of the privileges that we have now and those that we still have to come. I think that they have been the leaders for us in that fight. And I think, to your point, those who were courageous enough, brave enough to live their true genderqueer self is where those stereotypes really got just kind of taken away to a certain extent. Of course, they're still there, sometimes jokingly, sometimes seriously. Generally, though, genderqueer folks have been the ones to help break down those barriers and show the rest of us like it doesn't have to look this way or that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, well said. So as a grad student, you wrote a clinical guide to help clinicians work more effectively with LGBTQ folks. And you touched on this a little bit. You felt that there was a void based on your own experience. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think so much has changed that sometimes we forget it's changed in a very short amount of time. So if you think about marriage equality, we really haven't had it that long at all. For us to be able in both the state of North Carolina and federally to have same-sex relationships to be seen the same as opposite sex relationships. And we can get into the logistics of like sex and gender and all of that. But if we're simply just looking on paper, we now have the blanks of spouse and spouse. It is no longer husband and wife. And so that really hasn't happened that long ago. I mean, it's like 2016, 2014, depending upon state or federal. And then around that same time is when I was going into my master's. And there really weren't that many presentations, trainings, you name it, where clinicians could learn about the LGBTQ community and how best to serve them. And so I kind of came into this right at the time that it was taking into the mainstream for mental health professionals. And I wanted to address the gaps that had been there with this guide so that it was easily accessible both for clinicians and consumers of mental health.
Right. I think that was such a great initiative. I can't help thinking of this story. I was seeing a therapist, oh gosh, it was probably 15, 20 years ago. And I mentioned that I was dating a woman and he said, "Yes, I have heard of this."
Okay. Yeah, so rigid, right? And like that was the great experience I had in doing that guide, because the faculty who was helping me with doing the research was like, you'll be lucky if you get 30 people to respond. Well, I almost had 300 people respond. And to my mistake, lesson learned for all the researchers out there, I was doing qualitative data, which means I had people submitting sentences to paragraphs worth of data. So I basically carried around, because I'm totally old school, I carried around printed out versions of their responses with different colored highlighters and like would just sit and go through and find themes. And it was overwhelming at the response. And to your point, it was like, we just want to be treated like people. Like it's not something that we're expecting you to fully even accept. We just want you to be welcoming and affirming. And I think, your example shows how it all of a sudden can become a very awkward conversation. And then you in turn might not feel comfortable opening up about other things.
Yeah, it didn't open the door for me to talk. I didn't sense any animosity, but it was kind of like, okay, I can see you're a beginner at this topic. So
Yeah. Hmm.
it didn't offend me, but it was kind of comical actually.
Yeah.
Um, so you're an officiant for commitment ceremonies. How did that come about? And do you have any good stories to tell?
I don't know if I have good stories to tell. I'll tell how it happened, which I think is a good story. I had several friends who were getting married around the same time, and somehow they had all decided individually that I was to be their backup officiant, but no one ever told me. So by the like second or third time this happened, I just said, I'm just going to go ahead. I'm just going to get ordained, and I'm just going to have it for the next time that the next wedding comes up and I'll be ready. Um, so yeah, in North Carolina, you can, uh, it might have changed, so don't quote me on this, but back when I got my officiant license, it was basically either you go to like a magistrate, which is the legal way to go about it, or you find someone from a faith-based community to do it. So there really wasn't like an in between. And that's why I ended up becoming an ordained minister, because in North Carolina, that gave me what I like to jokingly say, the power to sign the paperwork for any legal ceremonies that anyone would want me to perform.
That's pretty neat. I could see you doing that. Do you, is there a script that you follow, like a standard script, or do people write their own?
Um, so far, people have asked me to write it. So I will try to go based off the personalities of the individuals and try to figure out like what's important to them. So, for example, one couple may want to recognize their parents. And so maybe we have like a rose offering ceremony in there. At my best friend's wedding, they are huge, like geeks and sci-fi and comics and things of that nature. Plus, my best friend and I grew up on the Princess Bride movie. And so I used the wedding scene from that movie as a part of it. I used some of like the books and movie quotes that I could to kind of interweave in. So for me, it's not like do you take this person to be your spouse and, honor and hold and love and sickness and blah, blah, blah. It's more like I'm going to tweak it to fit the couple and their personality.
Huh. Well, who knows? Maybe someday I'll be giving you a call. Never know.
Yeah, go for it. I'm happy. Like, I can sign the legal papers, or if you've got more than two partners as a part of the ceremony, I mean, I'm open to whatever. Love is love, and I'm just happy to be a part of it.
All right, wonderful. So you've had some struggles, some tough times in life, but you've accomplished quite a lot. What are you most proud of?
I think most people would expect me to say my PhD. People find that like it kind of holds some weight or status, and I don't even care to be called Dr. Sia. I'm happy with people just calling me Dana, like I always have been. To me, all I did was write a really long paper. So I don't even know that that would be my greatest accomplishment. I had actually asked my students in class to talk about their greatest accomplishment. And so after they all presented, I was like, all right, my turn. I made them do it. I'm going to do it too. And I talked about what I felt was my greatest accomplishment, which I'll still stand to only 3 days later. It's still my greatest accomplishment was when I helped to coordinate a conference on LGBTQ mental health and suicide risk. It was the first of its kind in North Carolina. We held it in Asheville as a part of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They have a conference series focused on LGBTQ suicide risk. And I was able to bring in, I think we had 12 breakout sessions. We had two researchers, and we had one like luncheon speaker. And they all came from various backgrounds. So we had, of course, like your psychologists, your counselors, but we also had criminal justice and religious leaders. And I was really intentional in building it around a wholesome and like a whole person, whole system type approach to this conference, because we know, and we talked about this at the panel, it's not just about finding the right therapist. It's about having a safe space in your community. It's about having access to the resources that you need. And so I knew that this conference needed to be holistic in nature and really look at the whole person and the whole system. So I think that was probably my biggest accomplishment to date. One day over and done, but still look back on that really fondly.
Yeah, those events can make such a big difference. And Asheville is kind of the perfect town for it.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. So tell us about your father.
Yeah, he was just a great all-around guy. Just his sense of humor, always had a joke ready. He was a great cook. When we went camping, he was always the one who was under the tarp. Even I think there were a few times we had like tornado type weather happening with hail, and he still had out there, cooking, and just really fun loving and supportive. He was quite often the one that I would call if something went wrong and try to find out, like, what do I do about this? So he was a huge support. And I think even for those of us who knew him and loved him as close as we did, during and after his funeral, after he died from suicide, there were people that came up and told stories we had never heard of, how he had supported them and what he meant to them. So the numbers that showed up for his funeral, I think, really spoke to all the lives that he touched.
Wow, that sounds so bittersweet. So bittersweet.
It is. And I talk about that as well, because without his death from suicide, I don't know that I would be in the position that I'm in. Because as a survivor of suicide loss, I connected with other survivors. I connected with the cause for suicide awareness and prevention. I worked with the Tennessee Suicide Prevention Network, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and of course, Nami. And all of that was really spurred on by his death. Would I have been involved in those things without his death? Yeah, maybe, to the extent and passion that I do now, maybe not. So yeah, even though it was a huge loss for us, losing him as a person, it really helped me to focus on, like, where do I want to put my time and effort for the rest of my life?
Sounds like that gave you a spark.
For sure. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So what were your dark days like around that time? How did you manage that?
Thankfully, I had really supportive coworkers. I was living in Tennessee at the time. And it was kind of ironic because I had like just graduated from college. This was my first full-time job, and I actually ended up coming out on the third day. Inadvertently, it was a small Tennessee town. They were talking about at their church, or they might have gone to different churches, but somewhere along the lines, a sermon came up about how you would witness to people who were LGBTQ and try to bring them into the faith. And so then they, had this conversation, kind of me on the sidelines, and then turned to me and asked me what I thought. And like in the slow-mo situations that we sometimes have, my response is essentially like, I am queer. And so that was an interesting experience, because I later learned when I was leaving during my exit interview, my boss told me that they actually went behind my back and tried to get me fired. And he was very much like, no, we've hired her, like, we're going to continue, we're going to keep her. And I'm so glad that he did, because they truly became two huge supporters in my life. I became very, very close to them. Yeah. Like there's opportunity and room for growth, even for folks who feel very set in their ways. And they were very supportive through that time. Another coworker ended up losing her dad around the same time for a different reason. And just, they were so family focused. They were very understanding of me when I would drive home for different things. And so, yeah, I just had a huge support system at work. And then the Survivors of Suicide Loss group that I was a part of became another huge support for me, Because for those of us who are survivors of suicide loss, we know that loss is like no other loss. I've had many losses throughout my life, and this one was very, very different in the way that people reacted, the way they talked about it or didn't talk about it. And so having people who really got that experience and being able to not only have them support me also support them, that is really what got me through. And I think many of us would say that as well when we think back on our darkest days and our toughest times. It's those people that are there for us that are part of the reason why we get through that, so that we can get to the other side.
Mhm. What do you wish people knew more about suicide?
That the first response to like hearing the word or someone saying they're having thoughts of suicide, I would hope that maybe we could like take a collective breath and approach it with more of empathy and care versus like the immediate concern of like, oh my gosh, I need to call 911, like you need to go to the ER. Because I think if we were all honest with ourselves, more of us have had thoughts of suicide than is probably being counted. Whether those
So,
are, yeah.
excuse me. So you're referring to, if I say to you, I'm having thoughts of suicide, try to take it down a notch in terms of your response.
Yeah, yeah, and just sit and be there with the person. Just listen and offer up the support. Immediately taking someone to a mental health professional in the ER is not the best response. We know that from the research. It can actually make the situation worse. They came to you for support, and so I would just ask any of us who are working with folks who experience thoughts of suicide or have a loved one come to you with thoughts of suicide to just take a deep breath, take a step back and say, what would you like to talk about? I'm here to listen to you.
Mhm. Yeah, as someone who has facilitated many NAMI connection recovery support groups, I really hear that so many times. Just having people listen, having their feelings validated, having other people in the room say, me too, I've been there.
Mhm.
That will really lift the person up enough that they're okay for a while after that. Doesn't
I think
resolve everything.
no, but you hit on it. You hit on exactly it. We think we're the only ones having those thoughts. We think we're the only ones having that experience. And we might be afraid of sharing that experience with someone else because of the potential reaction that they may have. So to have a supportive reaction of like, yeah, I've been there and that was really tough and I got through it, shows that other person like there is light at the end of the tunnel. So I love that. I love that you found that in your groups, because I think that can be the key support.
Yeah, it was a big relief to realize
It
that
is.
topic, it can be diffused just with empathy and listening, which you've said, and someone in the chat is also saying, Gail Pruitt, our psychiatric nurse.
Mhm.
Um, what brought you to NAMI?
So it was, I can't even remember how I got introduced to NAMI. I think it was probably through a support group, which is often how these resources get shared. It's like, hey, check out this organization. They, have really helped me. And I kind of had danced around the edges of NAMI, like had maybe gone to some presentations or been involved in some work. And then y'all had a conference in 2016, and I had never presented at a conference before. I've spoken before, but I'd never really done like a research backed type presentation. And I decided, for who knows what reason, that I was going to do that at this conference. And it really, again, that was one of the defining moments in my life that told me, like, this is what you're meant to do. The response that I got, the support that I got, the affiliates who invited me in year after year and continue to reach out to me to say, you were so great at that conference. Can you come bring that to our area? And that also, I think, helped to spur where part of the research for my guide that I created in my master's came from. And so I really attribute that moment as a really defining moment towards my later and current career.
And for those who don't know, Dana presented at the National NAMI conference recently. and did a fabulous job there. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, and I think it would be no surprise to anyone that I presented on supporting transgender, gender non-binary folks who have thoughts of suicide. So working on suicide prevention, because another conversation that I was hearing was there was a lot of the stories of trans folks were more focused on the trauma than they were focused on that light at the end of the tunnel, on the success on the other side, on the shared experience, like what we've talked about already. And so I wanted to change the conversation. Instead of focusing so much on risk factors and trauma, I wanted to focus on protective factors and what we can do every day to support the transgender, gender non-binary community.
That is good stuff. And we have an LGBTQ plus mental health support group out of Nami, North Carolina. We have great conversations there. So if you're interested in that, check out our virtual listing of programs at naminc.org. And there is a lot of discussion from trans individuals at the group. There's, good showing from the trans community in our support group.
Right.
So what are some ways to find a mental health therapist, especially one that meets your needs?
Yeah, this is a question that I get asked a lot because I know right now it can be very difficult in finding a therapist because many are full. Many of us are full. Many of us are scaling back because we've been overwhelmed over the past year and a half, just like everybody else. And also trying to find that additional layer of competence and affirming care from a mental health professional. So there are directories out there that you can search and you can plug in like, LGBTQ broadly, you can plug in your sexual orientation or your gender identity. You can actually search for providers who specifically have shared identities to what you have. And I think really the key to finding the best fit is going to be asking them to just sit down and talk for maybe 10, 15. I offer up 20 minutes to just talk and see if we're a good fit. I think that is how you're going to learn, is that person affirming or not? Peg, if you had the opportunity to say what you did in an information session versus before you started getting set up with this person for services, you would have known like, bye, gotta go, I'm gonna go find someone else. So I think that really personal connection, take advantage of that. Find what you can to talk to them. Ask your friends because they might have found a great mental health professional. And you can also reach out to those who do match what you want and aren't taking clients to see if maybe they have some referrals that they can offer up. Because many of us work together. I'm a part of a group of non-binary therapists. And so we know in that group, it's a very small group, that we feel comfortable referring to any of the other providers in that group. Don't limit yourself. I know that insurance and money can be very limiting and it can be very important. I would recommend that you go in with a little bit of an open mind and see how you might work with the provider to get your needs met around money, because there are other opportunities and you don't have to just go with who is in network with your insurance. So definitely just keep your mind open. If you have more questions about this, I am happy to answer that more in depth. If you reach out to me outside of this short conversation to talk about what the benefits are and how to maybe make that happen. But I really think assert yourself in having that conversation. Find if there's a true connection with that person.
And it seems like a good time to bring in a question that was in the chat box earlier. I'm going to go ahead. Being a leader of the faith community, a member of the LGBTQ community, what are your thoughts on conversion therapy?
Yeah, and I don't even know if I would consider myself a leader in the faith community, so I'm very honored by that comment there. I think, conversion therapy and pretty much everything maybe therapy related was initially intended with something good intent. There was something there to try to address the struggle or the concerns of folks. And I think it really got taken in the wrong direction because instead of actually what we've talked about, sitting down and listening with an empathetic ear and trying to find out where that person is, meeting them where they're at, the mental health therapists who created and continue to use conversion therapy are, in a sense, trying to alleviate the suffering by having the person conform to what they think is right and what they think will alleviate the suffering based on their own values. And that is where it gets really tricky. As I'll speak for like counseling with the American Counseling Association and our code of ethics, we do not impart our values onto clients. That is a really clear boundary. We talked about boundaries earlier. That is a very clear boundary that we have. And if you are doing that, you are going against the code of ethics. So did it come from a place of care and concern and then turn into something nasty? Yes. And should it be used? Absolutely not. So I would encourage more and more of us to advocate with our legislature. And often what this looks like is our local state Senate and our local House of Representatives, your local political leaders, because our US senators here in North Carolina don't always have that power. So talk to your local leadership about how do we move this forward, so that we can put into place protection for especially LGBTQ minors when it comes to conversion therapy.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that question that came through on Facebook. And so if I'm an ally, how can I show support for the LGBTQ community with regards to mental health?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of ways that we've actually already talked about. So working to help those folks who are coming to you and asking for referrals or suggestions of competent providers. So being able to connect them with resources, just simply listening, being empathetic, showing that the person is valued. I talked about this in my NAMI national presentation. The feelings of being accepted and valued are key. And so how do you provide that to that person? Because there is a potential concern or suspicion about the mental health profession. So I totally get that. So sometimes we as community members can be that support and encouragement, and then, finding additional help. And I think, and I've mentioned this before in many presentations, so if you've seen me before, you're probably like, I know this is coming. It's the simple things. It's using gender neutral language when possible. It's sharing our pronouns. It's wearing a rainbow flag, having a trans flag, whatever it might be, just to show, even if you're not saying it out loud every time, you're showing those little visuals of support to everyone that you meet.
Yeah, excellent points. And it's important to know that folks in the LGBTQ community are much more likely to attempt suicide. I'm sure because of the stigma, the oppression surrounding those identities, and the way society has historically treated that community slash us. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people ages 10 to 24. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth seriously contemplate suicide at almost 3 times the rate of their straight counterparts. They're almost 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide compared to heterosexual youth. And the statistics go on and on, especially in our rural areas where you don't have the diversity, you don't have that level of support, or culturally competent providers are so much harder to find. So it's really important to be that ally and maybe just ask, how are you doing? How are you dealing with that headline that's all over the news today? So just want to put in a plug for that.
Mm-hmm. And I heard a story recently of a teacher who was approached by a student who was a part of the LGBTQ community, and all the student wanted was support in starting a gender and sexuality alliance at their school. And the teacher was upfront, like, I don't necessarily know everything about the LGBTQ community. I'm just here to provide that role of faculty advisor and support this student and the other students who come to the group. So it can be in just little ways, even if you don't feel like you're 100% competent, which Hint, hint, none of us are. Um,
Right.
so just doing your best and being as affirming as possible can go a really long way in just one person's life.
Mhm. Absolutely. And what gives you hope?
I think conversations like this, what would we be having this conversation like 6, 7, 10 years ago? Maybe not. So just having this conversation and being able to, what we've talked about, have a visual space to show like the community is here and we are here to support you and we are available and we want to provide whatever we can, whatever support that we can. And I think that is a key difference of thinking like 10 years back, just the visibility of the community, the visibility of this conversation, the greater comfort and willingness for us to have conversations about mental health, about suicide that we weren't having 10 years ago. I think a lot of that has changed in a very short amount of time, and that continues to give me hope. If we go back to the conversation about that first full-time job that I had where I came out, my coworkers tried to get me fired, and after that we became, really, really close. Stuff like that gives me hope. I tend not to give up on anybody because I know there's something in there that you will connect with someone else. And when we connect on that personal human level, it's really hard to hate each other.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, I think if we keep our hearts open and just don't let, when I was younger, I had to check a certain number of boxes before I would even get to know someone because I didn't want to be rejected or I didn't want to have that hard conversation. And now I try to sort of keep it open and get to know them and find the common ground first. It's harder to do sometimes, but it's worth it.
Hmm.
All right. So, folks who are in our virtual studio audience, I'm so glad you're here with us. I'm seeing a lot of wonderful comments in the chat. We're going to get your questions in just a minute. First of all, I want to give a shout out to the folks who are helping out behind the scenes, psychiatric nurse Gail Pruitt, who's helping out on Facebook and the chat box, Executive Director Gary Kreitz for managing the chat box and for always being there. And of course, thanks to Dana, our guest, for spending your evening with us. Now we've got an awesome video of the week. And this is a very short film featuring our guest here. Very touching information. I think you're going to like it.
The night that he died, I had a dream that we were standing in this grass off the side of the road. He was just standing there saying that everything was fine. I was very close to my dad. We were always talking. Anything he was doing, I was kind of his tag along. He was hilarious. He always had a joke or always came up with something funny to say. I didn't know that my dad was bipolar. It was not something that he wanted to talk about. And I believe that he was treating himself with the alcohol. He asked me one day what he should do, and I told him I didn't know, that he would have to figure that out. I was a teenager. My understanding is the next day he went into rehab. He came out sober. He stayed sober for several years. And right before he was to get his 6-year chip, he started drinking again, and they would not give it to him. And that crushed him. And that is when he started to spiral down. And I think he lost control. He felt like he lost control of his life when he did not get that 6-year chip. On the day of his death, I believe he went to a gas station, but he didn't go out and do much. He was mainly around the house, and around 1 o'clock, he shot himself. and that was how he died. Around 1 o'clock, I was actually trying to call him because I hadn't heard from him. To know that I was calling him right before or right as he was dying, you feel kind of helpless. Like if he had answered the phone, would I have said the right things? Would I have been able to help him? I don't know. I dealt with my pain by helping other people through theirs. Now we've got walks like the Out of the Darkness walk, bringing the awareness to the community that suicide affects all age groups, all genders. It doesn't matter who you are, it can affect you. It makes me feel a lot better that they aren't in it alone, that everyone is there together to support each other. I would not have to tell my dad that we love him or that we miss him, because I know he knows that, but I would tell him that something great has come of his death, that I have been given great opportunities that I would not have otherwise been given, and people have been helped because of what happened to him. I know that my dad can see everything that I'm doing. To have him back here would not be so much to show him what I'm doing, but more to have his support, to hear his jokes.
What a beautiful video. Yeah, well, so thank you for allowing us to share that. I know it's intense and it's just so beautifully done. And I really was struck by it on so many levels. The sort of the lyrical comments and all the nature images and your tone of acceptance, and I guess the resilience that comes through, that you took one of the most difficult things a loss that anyone can survive, and moved that into your mission. That it gave you a spark. So thank you for all that you do and for allowing us to share that. And now we're going to spend some time taking questions from you, members of our virtual studio audience. If you're newer to Zoom, you want to type your question in the Q&A box, please. You can see a little conversation bubble sort of towards the bottom left of your screen. Click on that, magically type a question. It will appear to us. First question is from Gary. And well, I think I'll backtrack and read some comments from the chat box about the film. That was amazing. I have such mixed emotions after seeing your sadness and your use of your loss for good. Just comments of thanks and more accolades for the video.
Yeah, huge shout out to the director and producer, Alex. He is wonderful. If you get a chance to look him up, he continues to do amazing things. He did 3 short documentaries like that for 3 different survivors of suicide loss. And I was honored to be included in that. And he just continues to speak to really tough topics in really hopeful and uplifting ways.
It almost has a sacred feel to it, to me. The music and the imagery and your words, very beautifully done. So question from Gary, what does a person experience when they are not addressed by their correct pronouns?
Yeah, and I like the wording that is used here. So correct pronouns instead of preferred pronouns. That always has kind of sat with me really odd. Like it's not a preference. It's correct pronouns. Our chosen pronouns, our personal pronouns. It's thrown around in a lot of different ways. And I think for me, correct pronouns sits the best. So when our correct pronouns are not used and not recognized, I mean, to our core, it can feel very invalidating. It can feel like we are not seen. It can feel like the person doesn't care enough to do this to small step to connect with us and to show respect and acknowledge who we are. So I think everyone's experience is going to be a little bit different. Some people may kind of brush it off and it may not be a big deal. And for some people, it can be very heartbreaking to have someone not use the correct pronouns. So I just come back to this being such a small step. And I know it can be hard in some instances, in some contexts. And I think just showing the effort, apologizing briefly, moving on if you make a mistake, and then doing your best to get it correct can go a long way in making that human connection we talked about before.
Right. Pronouns can be challenging. Just speaking for myself, I have a transgender sister and I was the first sibling she told. So I had that position of trust for which I was very, very grateful. And of course, I was supportive wholeheartedly and did whatever I could. But I have a mental, it's hard. It's a hard transition to make with someone I've known for, 50 years. And but I at least apologize when I mess that up.
Yeah, and that's all we can do is just keep practicing. I think another common comment that is made is like they, them pronouns are not technically singular pronouns, which if you look at any of the current guidelines for writing, it is accepted for use as singular. If it was used by Shakespeare as singular, I mean, it goes way back, they, them being used as singular. And I bet that you've probably used it, even if you didn't realize it, something along the lines of, oh, look, someone left their wallet. I bet they would like us to hold on to it for them. So you probably use it in a lot of contexts and don't even think about it. So just kind of shifting and practicing and trying to remind yourself, I think can go a really long way in showing that you care.
Very good summary. Question from Facebook. How can I help?
Loaded question. There are a lot of ways that you can help, both big and small. So some of the small ways we've talked about, just using your own pronouns, sharing your pronouns, maybe even exploring your own gender identity and sexual orientation and figuring out like, what does it mean for you? So if you've gone through life and never really second guessed it, maybe now's the time to not necessarily second guess it, just explore it. Why do you have that sexual orientation or gender identity? What about it makes you you? So that maybe you can start to connect with others who have different gender identities and different sexual orientations. Go to trainings, go and learn as much as you can. If your jam is podcasts, there's a lot out there that you can listen to. There's YouTube videos. If you like to read, there's really great books and articles, especially those first person accounts. Anything you can do to learn more so that you can make more affirming actions. And then on the larger scale, if you want to get involved in volunteering, if you want to donate your time, your money, your energy into various activities for the LGBTQ community, we have multiple LGBTQ centers across North Carolina, both in our communities and at our colleges and universities. Talk to them, find out what sort of support they might need. What are they hearing from the LGBTQ community with regards to mental health and suicide concerns? And the list is really endless. So find your passion, find what works best for you, for your time and your energy, and then, give as much as you can and take breaks when you need to.
Okay, and so to narrow it down a little bit, this came from Shepherd Kevin, who's sharing some information on Facebook, so I'm assuming I can share it as well. His father completed suicide and he has attempted several times. How can he help with the suicide prevention movement? And he shared that he's gay.
Sure.
Thank you so much for that, Shepherd.
Yeah, I think that it shows already from your comment that you have a passion in this area and that you want to put in time and effort. So I would start by reaching out to organizations like NAMI, like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and find your local affiliate or local chapters, local walks, local events, and see how you can become involved. One of the biggest ways that we have done over the last few years is just an awareness. So awareness of the supports offered by NAMI and AFSP. Peg mentioned the group earlier. What a great resource for somebody who is like, I need help. I want to know where to go. Here's this group. I'm assuming it's free, right? It's
of course
easily accessible, like most things at NAMI. So you're good to go. Like that is a great resource to share. So I think having those resources, getting involved in the local efforts. I know we often think big picture and we want to make big waves. And for me, what I have found is those small ripple effects really have larger impacts. And so start at the local level, find your local affiliate, find your local chapter, your local walk or events, see how you can volunteer your time, your effort, your energy. I think that for me anyway, has been the best way for me to get involved. I saw a little bit earlier, we've got some of our AFSP folks on here from Facebook and also in Zoom. So it's great to see you all. And I think any one of us would tell you that we are like a family. We get to know each other. We have fun together. And so any ways that you want to get involved, we can find a place for you.
Yeah, so, and I did put that link in the chat box. I'm sure it will be transferred to Facebook soon. The LGBTQ plus mental health support group, which I should mention is spearheaded by our partners, NAMI Wake County, and also the LGBT Center of Raleigh. So without those two, that group would never have happened.
Yeah.
All right, another question from Gary. Can you talk a little about intersectionality? When a person is part of more than one overlapping communities, both of which are oppressed, what special challenges do they experience?
Mm-hmm. And I think this is really going to be specific to the person based upon how their identities intersect. This is what my dissertation was based on, was intersectionality theory. So looking at the different layers that we have as individuals and how those layers overlap and what it means for our experience. So I think if we can think about one time when we were oppressed and then consider how that felt and the effect that it had on us, and consider others who might be going through 2 times that, 3 times that, 4 times that, depending upon what identities intersect and the context and environments that they're in. I think that is really what it comes down to. It's not about the person so much as it is about the system or the environment or the context. So for those of us who find ourselves as leaders, who find ourselves at the table making big decisions, the more that we can consider the different identities that are underneath the layer of groups that we are working with, the better off we are. So I'll just give one brief example. In our latest syllabi in the ECU Department of Addictions and Rehabilitation Studies, we have added a specific section about personal name, pronouns, and having that identified in every way possible the student would like. So that includes on our emails, that includes in our Canvas, which is like our learning system online. And so it came down to the faculty saying that this is really important. We recognize this is not only important for the students, it's important for how we as a department interact with the community at large. And so just recognizing those aspects of who's coming to the table and how we can support them. I also work a lot with neurodivergent folks. So thinking about how do we make those environments more welcome to them. Perhaps we provide more visuals. We give more of an agenda so there's less surprises. We limit any of the overstimulation that could be happening in various environments. So there's a lot of ways that we can think about how these overlap and how we can support folks. So I get to my last point, which is to invite these folks, the ones who find themselves at the intersections, to the table to let us know what they need. If I don't identify in certain groups, I would never make decisions for those groups or decisions about how that environment would look for those groups. I'm going to bring them in to share their feedback so that I am best meeting their needs. And I think that's part of what we're doing tonight, is just bringing up the topic to the table where the people who are involved in this, the people who are being affected by these decisions, are the ones letting us know how to best support them.
Okay. And another question, what is dead naming?
So dead naming is when someone is basically using like a name that was given at birth or a name given by a family that the person no longer identifies with. So that it's just essentially back to the correct pronouns. They're not using the correct name. Sometimes people are insistent, this is a name that we gave you, this is a name that you're born with, we're going to use this name, and that is dead naming. So essentially saying like that name is dead is how that person might be referring to their name and saying, I'm not using that name is dead, this is my name. So hopefully that helps to answer that question.
Mm-hmm. And how do you navigate, if I've known someone for maybe 5 years and I'm telling a story about who they were 5 years ago, which name do I use?
Well, I think first I would ask the person what their preference would be, because I think everybody has different preferences as far as like using pictures when they were younger, for example. So I think first ask the person, and your best bet is to stick with the name that they use and use the correct name throughout, unless they've otherwise given you permission. I think it's, respectful, again, affirming of who they are, that it doesn't mean that they were a different person. They're the same person. And so just acknowledging that and affirming that by using the correct name.
Okay. And you have another question. You have so much experience with support groups, especially suicide survivor. What did you learn from those?
Honestly, that is where I learned most of how to work with folks as a mental health professional. So both being a member of support groups and being a leader of support groups, that is where I learned the most, because the people who needed the support were expressing what they needed. They're expressing their experiences. And I was able to sit back and, I was honored to be able to hear their stories and to hear what they had gone through so that I knew how to do it better moving forward. I think I learned more from the actual participants in the groups than I did as necessarily the leader of the group. I always made sure that what they needed came first. And in that, I learned a lot about people, their experiences, and what they need.
As someone who's led Nami connection recovery support groups, I have the same experience. It's just, I got so much more than I gave. It's really incredible that way.
Yes.
So, and of course, it's a good time to remind everyone, all of NAMI's services are free. We have classes, we have support groups, we have presentations. And whether you're someone who lives with a mental health challenge, you're a neurodiverse individual, or you love someone who's in that category, we have support groups for both sides of the equation, because sometimes we need our own space where we can be very candid about what we're going through as a family member, as a loved one, or as someone with a mental health challenge. So check out our website, NamiNC.org. We've got a listing of virtual programs, all free, and we'd love to see you there. We have a lull in the questions. Please feel free, members of our virtual studio audience, to ask more. While we're pausing, I'll mention our next week's topic, mental health in the workplace. I will actually be on vacation So our executive director, our awesome executive director, Gary Kreitz, PhD, will lead the discussion on mental health in the workplace, something he's pretty good at fostering. He's good at psychological safety. And he'll be having some wonderful guests, Joy Brunson Zuboko, a therapist and vice president of Southeast Operations for Recovery Innovations International. She's out of Durham. And Amy Robertson, who's held executive leadership roles at Red Hat. She's now CEO of her own company, Soul Advantage. So please join us next week. Gary will be having a wonderful conversation with those two leaders in their fields. And that'll be right here on Thursdays with Nami, September 2nd at 7 p.m. Also, please fill out the survey that will magically appear when you close out of this Zoom session. I'm sorry, Facebook folks, that we haven't figured that one out yet, but if you are interested in filling out a survey for us, I would be so grateful. Contact me at pmorrison@naminc.org. That helps us improve over time. It helps us put on a better show, and it allows us to show our funders what we're up to too. All good things. And what else have we got here? Do you have any closing statements, Dana?
I'm just so appreciative of everyone who's shown up tonight and who is wanting to learn more, especially about how to be involved. I think the both of us would agree that you know, when your passion falls in this area, however you can get involved, we want you involved. We want to have you on board with us and doing the work that we do. So we invite you all to join us as we work with NAMI and support NAMI.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Nice comment on the chat box. This has been a great session. Thank you for that. Lots of good comments on resources in the chat box too. What is neurodiversity? And if you're looking for resources, you can always call the NAMI North Carolina helpline. Our system has a lot of wonderful opportunities for healing. People like Dana. It can also be complex and fragmented, just to call it what it is. So call our helpline to get help, to find the wonderful people. 1-800-451-9682 is our helpline, 1-800-451-9682. Another comment, thank you, Dana, for your compassion, wisdom, knowledge, and skills. They really came through. So I'll echo that sentiment. Let's see. So I'm not seeing new questions. We tend to go with the energy each week. We go as long as we have questions. So I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. And thanks especially to Dana for sharing your story, your expertise. You've done a lot of different things. You've got a lot of skills and you know, life experience that you bring to the table. So we really appreciate you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful week ahead. I'm going to miss you next week, but I'll be back on September 9th. Be well in the week ahead. And remember, it's okay to talk about mental health. It's okay to not be okay. At NAMI, we are here to listen. Good night, everyone. Right. Thank you, Dana.
Of course.